Being given Simon of Cyrene as the person to speak about in the Lenten series made me think a lot. I first had to look him up, as I only had one recollection of his role in the Easter story. My searching for information and references to him in the Bible didn't take long. There wasn't that much to find. He receives just 3 mentions, once each in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The implication from these 3 texts being that he was simply a bystander who was called upon to carry Jesus' cross. Our job here today in M&M's in 2018 is to interpret and decide for ourselves how that must have felt and the lessons that we can learn today. I remember once as a smallish child listening to a sermon at the church I attended with my family. In the sermon, the priest explained that one view was that the gospel writers were the news reporters of the day, writing down events they witnessed, had heard about through word of mouth, or that were major topics of conversation in their time and location. This explanation has stuck with me as I've grown up, and as someone who tries to keep up with the news, it made a lot of sense as I have watched world events throughout my life unfold on the news. From a young age, my brother and I would sit together with our parents to watch the news and discuss it, so that we could learn more about the world we were growing up in. I often watched in horror, fear, or excitement as various events changed the world. Inadvertently, as very small children, we watched the Romanian dictator Ceausescu's execution on the 6 o'clock news. This obviously changed life for many Romanian people. On my 10th birthday, I was very excited to watch Germany's reunification and learn my first German word, die Wiedervereinigung. This sparked in me a long fascination with German language and culture and shaped some of my studies at school. I watched again as another nation dramatically changed on the day that Nelson Mandela walked free from jail after 27 years. This sparked an interest in South Africa and inspired me to visit and explore that country. As a university student, I watched as 9/11 shocked the world and made everyone feel much less safe and fearful for the future ahead. 2 years ago, with a group of my oldest students on a school trip to the UK, we watched news of Brexit live, and I listened as they tearfully spoke about how their world had gone so very wrong. Other news events to have an impact on me were the war in the Balkans, the tsunami, and the ongoing crisis in Syria. These news events have had a huge impact on the people directly involved in them, and indirectly on huge numbers of other people in a ripple effect. In the same way that Simon was perhaps an innocent bystander, all the people in the news probably start their day like any other, little expecting that their world or the worlds of other people around them are about to change so dramatically. I often think while I'm watching the news about how these people are such ordinary, everyday people who, due to the terrible events unfolding around them, find themselves, like Simon, thrust into the headlines. I feel the randomness with which this all seems to happen. Many of the people in the news stories never sought to be famous or even be noticed at all. Their fear, joy, grief, and disbelief is a raw and unexpected emotion that's thrust upon them. The events of their life have taken such a dramatic turn that they have become the headlines. Had there been film crews and members of the press in Jerusalem at the time of the Easter story, we would have had 24-hour news feeds, detailed explanations about Jesus' trial, witnesses reporting what they had seen and heard. Simon would have been constantly interviewed after the crucifixion, asking how he felt. Microphones and mobile phones would have been thrust out to capture the sounds and images of the unfolding scenes. Camera teams may have camped out along the route to Golgotha to get the pictures to be beamed around the world in seconds. Simon may have been vilified for helping and being involved when it was none of his business. Instead, what we had was Simon being like any ordinary bystander that we see in the news today. Bad luck, or luck, put him centre stage alongside Jesus for a brief moment of history. A moment that may have had a huge impact on his life, but isn't recorded. But it certainly left its mark for all time in the Bible. Looking into what we know of his life, Cyrene was a Greek settlement in Libya. So visually, he would have looked very different to the other people crowded into Jerusalem for Passover. At the time, he may have felt conscious of his being different and have experience of being treated as an outsider by the other people that he met in his daily activities. If he felt very much like an outsider, did he feel that he could not say no to the Roman soldiers? In the same way, other immigrants today may feel obliged to keep a low profile and not rock the boat in any way, and may find themselves being taken advantage of or cruelly treated. I couldn't find much information about what he might have been doing in Jerusalem. Was he trading, looking to make a new life? Or had he just heard a general hubbub of information about Jesus and wanted to come and see what everyone was talking about? It was the Jewish feast of Passover, so people would have been excited, busily preparing, and there would be plenty of opportunity for gossiping and sharing local news. Crucifixions were a part of life in the Roman Empire, and people would be used to seeing and hearing about them. I imagine many people here are opposed to the death penalty, but in different times and different places, it was and still is a threat. In the same way that trials are presented in the media today, Jesus' trial would have attracted a great deal of attention, and as a well-known prisoner, his walk to Golgotha would have drawn great crowds. Jesus had been found guilty, mocked, completely humiliated, and badly injured. The population of Jerusalem had very much turned against him. In the same way as crowds flocked to see people being hanged, drawn, and quartered in the past for entertainment, the people of Jerusalem would have been keen to see justice done. Simon may well have been one of those people, just swept along by the occasion, and who had gathered to mock Jesus and the other two prisoners on their final journey on earth. Whether the people of Jerusalem agreed with the decision or not, it was probably safer to go along with the crowd and the judgment of the Romans. It's fair to assume the crowd would have been shouting, spitting, possibly throwing food. Simon now found himself centre stage with these men sentenced to death as criminals. Perhaps Simon was just a part of the crowd and the Roman soldiers saw him looking mournfully at the awful events in front of him and thought he was sympathetic towards Jesus and called on him to carry Jesus' cross. The Roman soldiers, no doubt, would have been keen to get their grim duty over with. They had a nasty, violent job ahead of them and probably wanted it done with. So finding someone to help would have ensured it was speeded up. Perhaps this sympathetic man just felt that what was to happen was so awful and that if he could help, he would. It's a brave thing to push yourself forward, to go against the crowd and stick up for someone, or to back them when everyone else is against them. The one time I really did this, I got punched in the face. It hurt and I was left with a bloody nose and a split lip, but I was quite glad I stuck up for my friend who was being bullied. Fortunately for me, this did not make any headlines, and even to this day, my parents think I fell over rollerblading. In this 100th anniversary year of some women in the UK being given the right to vote, we still see so many examples through history, time and again, that people who stood up for what they believed in or tried to help were derided by the press. This ill treatment continued in their day-to-day lives, led by people whose opinions differed. Examples of people standing up and acting are those who fought against apartheid in South Africa, members of the civil rights movement in the US, and people all over the world campaigning for LGBT rights or environmental concerns. Simon may too have been on the receiving end of the anger and hatred of the Roman soldiers and the crowd that had previously been directing it at Jesus. He had suddenly, in their eyes, become equal to Jesus and was now part of this grim procession towards death, although completely innocent himself. Again, in our reading, we discover Jesus aligned with the marginalized people in society. It's not hard to imagine that Jesus was probably very frightened to suddenly be in the spotlight of this hostile and angry crowd. Perhaps having come forward or been pushed forward, there was no going back, and he simply had to be braver than perhaps he imagined he ever could be in order to help Jesus get to the top of the hill. From time to time, we all need help to get to the top of our particular hills. Sometimes they seem like a mountain, or even a range of mountains. Sometimes from the top of one, the next one just appears even higher. While climbing hills and mountains can be a fun activity outdoors, if your life, studying, working, or your relationships with others feel like mountains or hills, then that can be a huge challenge to overcome and find a way to get to the top of that hill. At times in our lives, we all have to find our own Simon of Cyrene who will help us with the burdens of our lives. Or perhaps indeed we're called in our own way to be a Simon for our friends and family, to share in their difficult times and support them the best we can. Simon must have been filled with doubts about what he was doing and may even have been wondering, why on earth did I even come here today? In the same way, we may not have all the answers to the problems of others who find themselves in need, but listening, offering advice, or other practical support can make all the difference to them in their life at that moment. Perhaps an unexpected kind gesture of support or solidarity, such as Simon's, can make a challenge seem a little more manageable. At different stages in my life, I've certainly been hugely grateful for friends and family who've helped me to overcome challenges that have made me fearful, anxious, or upset. Another thought that comes to mind when reading the passages about Simon is how we can ourselves serve God to contribute to a better and kinder world. Watching the news in the past few weeks has certainly drilled home to me the need for people to be much more compassionate, to stand up and to make those bold statements. The treatment of desperate people by charity workers, the insensitivity that members of the National Rifle Association and some politicians have shown towards survivors of school shootings, a general lack of support for people less fortunate, all show how far we have fallen away from Simon's example. Someone has to be a role model for us to help us to change behaviour and attitudes, and Simon, in his humble help, whether forced or volunteered, showed us a path that we can and should all aspire to take in our lives, one deed at a time. In the same way that the consequences of all the news events I mentioned earlier had a huge impact on the lives of the people around those headlines, and those consequences have rippled across time, the headlines at the time of Jesus' crucifixion continue to have an influence on us today. And the examples of the behaviour of Simon are an example for all of us. We may not get the headlines or be a large and measurable influence, but in and through small, thoughtful, helpful deeds, we can write our own story and support and develop the stories of others.